Request for bill introductions. Anyone has bill introductions? Bill introductions going once. Seeing no bill introductions. Moving on to the hearing on HB 2598. We're going to start with a description of the bill from Revisor Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. So everything in this bill happens pretty much on the last, second to last page, on page 8. And this bill is a couple of amendments to the Real Estate Brokers and Salespersons License Act on page 8. One of those changes is to the prohibited acts under that. And so the bill prohibits dealing in assignable contracts for the purchase or sale of certain real estate, and that is limited to residential housing and multifamily residential housing of 4 units or less. And I think that assignable contract issue is one that is maybe familiar to the committee. The second thing the bill does with respect to the section on prohibited acts is it makes a violation of that provision dealing in assignable contracts a deceptive act or practice under the Kansas Consumer Protection Act. And there's one other change you might note on line 22, a change that makes an exception to the prohibition that persons aren't granted a private right of action. So under the Consumer Protection Act, there is a private right of action for violations, and so that would permit someone to go ahead and pursue a private action under the Consumer Protection Act. The second change the bill makes is to the section on penalties for violations, and that provision is at the bottom of page 8. And again, that just gives a permission, gives the Real Estate Commission the authority to issue a cease and desist order. So that's the change there. And that's what the bill does.
Okay, any questions for the revisor? Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles, could you give me, let me find it here. Assignable contract. Can you give me a definition for that so I am clear on what we're talking about there? As it's referenced in line 10 on page 8.
This bill does not provide a definition. I don't think there is one in the act, but perhaps the conferees have one. They have one, they discuss it at some length in their testimony, what that is. So I would refer you to that. But, if we wanted to put a definition in there, we would probably need to do that.
Charles, the cease and desist, does that give them authority to cease and desist only on assignable contracts, or is that more broad than that?
No, I'm sorry. Yes, it is more broad than that. Yep. It's any, if a person has practiced without a valid broker's or salesperson's license issued by the commission. So in addition to any other penalties, then the commission can issue a cease and desist order.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Seeing none, go ahead. All right, we're going to go ahead and open up proponent testimony, and we'll start with Mark Toom, Vice President of Government Affairs for Realtors Association.
All right, Chairman Tarwater, members of the committee, my name is Mark Toom. I'm with the Kansas Association of Realtors. Thank you very much for allowing the opportunity to provide testimony on House Bill 2598. The reason we're here today is to protect consumers. This bill has two components, as mentioned by the revisor. And the first prohibits the predatory practice of wholesaling or marketing an assignable contract. This bill is slightly different. You've seen this issue 2 years ago in Senate Bill 382. That bill banned the practice of wholesaling, but then preserved the ability if you had a real estate license. And I think that created some concern that we were somehow preserving this power for licensees or realtors. And I'll say that this is where I'll tell you there's a difference between licensees and realtors. And I think that there's been some confusion on that. All realtors are licensees, but not all licensees are realtors. To be a realtor, you have to be a member of the National Association of Realtors, Kansas Association, and that also provides a local. And with that, you subscribe to a code of ethics, and that provides an additional level of how you conduct your business with people and expectations of you as in how you interact with your clients. And so there's a very big difference. But the process of wholesaling, we've determined that this is really a fraudulent practice. It very often goes after people who are unsuspecting, unwilling to maybe to reach out towards more professional services to find out what their property is worth. The people who are involved in these kinds of assignable contracts, they will go up to somebody who's just not aware of the value of their property and then assign that. The assignable contract is where they try to market to somebody else. They're under no obligation to provide what the property ended up selling for to the original seller. The buyer, you don't provide disclosures like you do, which consumers are, I think, expect. And so they're not under license law. So they are really marketing a property in violation of license law. And so there's a second part of this bill that provides cease and desist authority to the Real Estate Commission. That's identical to what was in previous bills. Right now, KREC, the Real Estate Commission, is charged with monitoring and disciplining people who have licenses. And we're seeing an increasing number of people who have are performing services that would normally require a license or are involved in a kind of a fraudulent space, and they're not being regulated because they simply have they don't have a real estate license. So it's really at that point, it would be an issue for the county district attorney or the attorney general's office for eyes of enforcement on there. And so the thought would be to have the Real Estate Commission would have another set of eyes to issue the cease and desist authority, similar to what many other regulatory and licensing agencies have across the state. So in conclusion, thank you very much for holding a hearing on this, and I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time. And I do have a realtor with me to also bring about some of the more personal stories and some of the faults of the practice of wholesaling.
Okay, right. We'll get to him in a minute. Are there any questions? Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to remember the discussion we had last year. So this is when you see the signs popping all up as they are in my neighborhood, that say we buy homes. There's a number on them. And these are the people that we're talking about. Is that correct?
It could very well be that is very, they do operate in that kind of an environment where they put up signs to market.
And I just want to make sure I understand what we're dealing with. In that scenario, we have somebody who maybe is in a cash-strapped situation and they want to sell their home, the one asset they have. Somebody comes in and says, "I'll pay you for this," but it's speculative. Is that right? The assignable contract portion is, I'm going to buy this house from you, but there's probably a contingency clause upon being able to sell it. And so the people vacate the home, they get out of it, they haven't, and then the home may or may not actually be sold, but they lose possession of it. Is that basically what we're talking about here?
Being in an assignable contract, they'll approach the homeowner and say, and very often it's a lowball offer. They just have no idea what they target communities that just maybe not have a good feel for what the value of their properties are. So they'll offer, say, $100,000 or whatever it is, but then they will then market that contract. The homeowner very often thinks they've sold their contract. in 30 days, they will have their money and they've already had that price. And then what will happen is they'll market that contract and they'll say they sell it for 150,000. At that point, they'll take that assignment fee. The person who they sold gets that 100,000. They have no idea that it really sold for 150,000. The person who bought it has no idea if there's anything wrong with the property because they're under no obligation to provide disclosures in the same way somebody who's licensed would be. And so that's the real problem. They can also walk away very easily. They'll have these contracts that are really ridiculous. They'll have like $10 earnest money associated with them, $10 or $15, so that if they don't market and sell that property within, that month, they can turn around and say, we're walking away, we didn't sell it. And leaving that, the consumer harmed again because they were, very often put in a situation where they're trying to sell a property very quickly, and they're being taken advantage of, and they're not able, and so it's a problem for the consumer.
And then, so on the final consumer, so we kind of understand how, or at least I kind of understand how the seller is being affected. On the buyer end, you're saying that person, because this is another, as you know, I'm working on another piece of legislation that's somewhat similar to this. In that scenario, the final buyer isn't provided information and isn't subject to any of the normal inspection processes or anything, disclosure processes. So in that case, we're probably dealing with cash buyers. Is that fair to assume?
Well,
The final person between the middleman, the guy on the other end of the middleman, is probably a cash buyer. They're not,
like,
right? Okay.
Yes.
So this largely, in this scenario, are we protecting, does this provide more protection for the seller of the property or the potential buyer of the property, or is it kind of balanced there?
I think it's the initial homeowner who has no real sense of what the house is valued. And so they're really losing out on the wealth that they've accumulated through home ownership. Yeah. And so that's really, I think very often you'll see these arrangements where people deal in these assignable contracts. They're dealing with an investment network, and they send their list to a wide variety of people. I get many of these, and I think you'll hear some stories about that as well.
I got a text message asking if I wanted to sell my house a while back. So to that point, do we have any, other than anecdotally, do we know how much this is happening in Kansas? I know anecdotally, I got text messages on my phone saying, do you want to sell this house? Right. I see signs popping up all over the lower income neighborhoods in my community. But how much are we seeing this happening in Kansas? How much harm is happening?
It does go in cycles. I think 2 or 3 years ago, before some of the recent valuation increases, there were a lot more people operating in this space. In the Wichita area, it seemed to be a very popular thing. There was an expose in the Kansas City market, and particularly on the Missouri side, about how there were groups that were engaged in really truly predatory practices and the lowballing of offers. So there's not a number out there, but I think that there's increasing numbers because some of our surrounding states have taken this more seriously. Oklahoma has banned the practice and only allowed licensees, and that's a similar path that many other states have followed. So there's a space here that they can occupy that space to do this kind of activity.
And then the triggering of the Consumer Protection Act, that would be a method to secure some recourse for presumably the seller of the home if they didn't get fair market value. And that would then transfer, the Attorney General then at that point would handle that and determine what the fair market value of that home might have been otherwise and try to recompense that person.
Well, at this point, the practice, we're trying to ban the practice completely. So if somebody is engaged in that practice, then the consumer protection law could kick in too. But the other part, cease and desist, would, and I think your other bill, people who are involved in contracts for deeds, and if they're involved in a kind of think more fraudulent space, I think this could also help in that situation because the Real Estate Commission would also have eyes on that area, because most of the people who are involved in that are not regulated by the real estate commission. And so I think that having a cease and desist authority would help with some of the situations that you brought to the attention of the Financial Institutions Committee earlier this week.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Dodson.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I just wanted to follow up on that last point. When we were in the financial institutions session, the case at hand there was a land sale. And when the lawyer was talking, he said that the judge found that this did not fall under the Consumer Protection Act. And you and I talked about it a little bit on the margins afterwards, but is there such a distinctive difference between these two types of transactions that would cause one to be under the Consumer Protection Act and one not?
I'm not sure of the specifics of that case. All that I just heard was from that hearing, and there were some, I think, some misstatements by that attorney, because I think that one, I wanted to point out that they were not a realtor. They're not currently a realtor. They're not currently a licensee. And so I think that that's something that is a difference there. But contract for deeds, which I think is often kind of not correctly referred to as rent to own, that's that kind of space. Whereas this is, assigning a contract. So there is more of a transfer of ownership that's in place in an arrangement like this. And so there are differences.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Representative Kessler.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a constituent reach out to me last year, and I just want to kind of see how this kind of molds into this, if you'd indulge me here. But they had a situation where they had somebody offer them money for their house, and they were going to market the house. They were clear that that person was going to market the house, trying to resell the house, and they would take over and make sure taxes were paid, insurance was on the house, and that sort of stuff, and take over the house. But what ended up happening is that they decided that marketing the house for sale wasn't really their thing right now, so they actually leased the house out and rented the house out. So they were renting the house out. Of course, they still have a mortgage on this house. They're still having to deal with that. But their contract didn't really stipulate that this was going to be a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, a year contract or whatever it was. And there's really kind of an open date for this other party to market the house. And they're just they have no access to the house, but they're still paying a mortgage on the house. And does this do something for that?
I think if that's somebody, that sounds like somebody who's operating in a space that's not a licensee, and they're maybe doing services and including marketing of a property, you have to be a licensee. So it sure sounds like somebody's operating in a space outside of the license, and that would be something for the cease and desist component of the bill, because there is real potential for abuse in a situation like that.
So in that same example, if that person did have a license, this bill would not apply.
If they had a license, because I don't think that that's necessarily the wholesaling aspect. It may be more of you're listing it or you're marketing it. I'm not sure the specifics, but if I think that if there are a licensee, then under the Real Estate Commission, they can certainly, there are investigation and punishment that could, or certainly an infraction that could occur that would be taken seriously if they're a licensee. If they're not a licensee right now, they're occupying in a space that would be dependent on the, district attorney or the attorney general's office, which too often is going to be bogged down by, I think, a lot of more serious crimes that maybe a real estate transaction crime might not rise to the level of their attention. So that's the goal, is to have another pair of eyes.
Any further questions? Representative Williams. Christy Williams.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were just talking back and forth, trying to clarify, is wholesaling illegal in any other state other than, you mentioned, Oklahoma?
It is illegal in multiple states for people who are not licensed. The most common model is to provide the ability to licensees. It's, for some reason, that's how the framework of many of the legislative legislation that's passed, it prohibits the act, but then allows it for licensees. And they do that simply because if you're a licensee, you have obligations to disclose and do certain things that people operating in the space would normally not do. So I think there are multiple states that have prohibited this act.
So the language that we are looking at today has been passed in other states, and Oklahoma is your best example.
Oklahoma has we've banned it for all both licensees and non-licensees. I don't believe there's another state that has done that. We've just viewed this as it's a fraudulent activity, and we've taken the feedback from when this was brought up the last time, and that the thought was that we were somehow preserving this for realtors or licensees, and we want to make it perfectly clear. We view this as a predatory practice, and it should be banned.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move on to your realtor that had a story to tell us, Jamie Sauter.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to be here. And if you guys want to tell stories, I can tell lots of stories. This is a nefarious activity, and it's evolving by the bad actors daily, and it comes in many different forms. And sometimes it's hard to share stories of the victims of this, because by the time they become victims, it's too late. But this rears its head in multiple ways. Just last week, I was sitting on my couch with my dog and got a phone call from a Kansas number. I can't remember what town it was from. And on the phone is this Jamie? And I said, yes. And they said, well, I'm interested in a property that you own in Emporia. Would you be willing to sell it? And I said, well, tell me a little bit about, how'd you find out about it? What's the address, and so on and so forth, and trying to glean some information, as any good salesperson would. And the young lady said it's 721 West 8th, and I see that you've had it for this long, but I really be really interested in buying it. And I said, well, are you in town now? Would you like to look at it? She said no, and I said, have you moved to Emporia already? She goes, no, I have to find a house. And I said, how soon do you need it? And so on. And then I finally said, well, where are you coming from? And she said, I'm coming from Topeka. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that town. Topeka. And, I'm in the business, and so it's easier for me to sniff out that kind of activity. And that was, so I was able to just hang up the phone. It wasn't a big deal. As we were waiting for this hearing to start, my plumber called me and said, hey, I got a phone call. Some gal wants to buy my rental property. Exact same thing, exact same scenario. The practice of the assignable contracts, and I'm happy to expand on that. I had a situation this morning. A widow called. She has a property in Lyon County, 59 acres, a house, an outbuilding, very desirable property, hunting ground. It's got some grass. And her husband passed away just about a year ago. She's ready to downsize into one of the rentals that we manage. And she goes, I just have no idea what this thing is worth. And I got to figure out somebody to help me. And it would have been very easy if I didn't have the laws in place that govern realtors and licensees in Kansas. It'd been really easy for me to go out and say, well, yeah, it's worth $200,000. And then turn around and sell it for the $450 that it's worth. And then the really scary part from where I sit, and I certainly want to leave time to answer any questions you might have, is how once they get a contract on a property, how they're going about liquidating those properties. Because what they're doing is they're posing as real estate professionals when they're not. I'm sure you've probably all received, whether you've opened it or not, spam emails that say off-market property for sale. Bidding starts on this date and ends on this date. They're posing as actual real estate professionals when they're not. They're using out-of-state numbers. They're using email addresses that you can't reply to, that you can't glean information. The only way you can get in contact with them is if you make a bid. And that's how they're doing it. They find someone who's unsuspecting, usually an elderly person, or someone who's struggling economically, perhaps, and they're they are flashing cash in front of their face to get their property under contract, knowing full well that it's not fair and it's certainly not fair market value. And then they're using a further nefarious activity with the posing as an auction for an off-market property that to people who are probably more savvy buyers, and they're finding that sweet spot between a good price that's well above the margin of what they negotiated on their assignable contract, and enough to make it a good enough deal for the next purchaser, who frankly doesn't care about the disclosures or the condition, because they're typically an investor and they see it as a real estate transaction as they normally would as if it was listed with a regular realtor. So the practice, it comes in many ways and shapes and forms, but it is becoming more and more frequent. And when we first started talking about this at the association level a few years ago, I think it was limited primarily to the metro areas. Well, it's creeping into the rural areas because we're seeing it in Emporia. We're seeing it in Emporia more frequently, and I think we're going to see it in more remote areas of the state as well. And I think that becomes an even more dangerous thing. And I also think that as other states have cracked down on it, Kansas has become a softer target for the practice, which also I think is a cause for concern. And I think that action by the legislature on this would certainly give the Real Estate Commission more ability to go after the people who they don't currently govern, who aren't licensed, and help curtail this practice. Thank you.
Sorry, Mac wasn't on. No questions. Moving on to Eric Wisner.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Tarwater and members of the committee. On behalf of the Kansas Real Estate Commission, I'm Eric Weisner, the Executive Director. We're here today to provide proponent testimony on House Bill 2598. The mission of the Real Estate Commission is to protect the public interest in selling, buying, and leasing of real estate. We feel that the bill proposed by the Association of Realtors makes several important changes to protect consumers. I won't go into detail about what the bill does in Section 1. The reviser and the association already did that, but I did want to address one kind of issue that was brought up in some of the questioning related to, what other states have done. And as was mentioned, many states have either have laws in place or have passed laws recently that make the act of assigning equitable interest in a purchase contract a activity that requires a license. However, I've had discussions with those states and the people that have similar roles that I do, and I'm like, well, how do you implement the laws? How are these individuals who weren't licensed able to basically continue to do what they do and have a license? And essentially what I've been told is, well, most of the time it's very hard for them. Their business model is not built on a fiduciary relationship with the seller that they are working with. Rather, it's to leverage the transaction to gain the most money. And if there's ever an issue with the property, they don't, and they can't find an investor who they can sell the property to, market the property to, they just back out of the deal. And oftentimes with respect to the seller, they don't even tell them why. There's a material defect in the title. Nope, sorry. Keep your $10 earnest money, as was referenced in some of the earlier testimony, and we're gone, and they're gone. Real estate licensees, regardless of their role, are required to disclose known material defects and provide certain mandatory disclosures. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as something that's been brought up to me, that other states who require that as a license have that issue. I'm going to focus my testimony more on the issue with the cease and desist orders. So in Section 2, the Real Estate Commission would be granted the ability to curtail activities requiring a license by granting the authority to issue cease and desist orders. Most agencies, departments, commissions within Kansas have this authority. And honestly, I don't know of any other state real estate commission that doesn't have this authority. I talked to my counterparts in all the neighboring states, and they all have cease and desist authority. Right now, when we are presented with a complaint related to unlicensed activity, and we find that they are doing activities that require a license, the only thing we can do is we give them a letter and it says, you may be in willful violation of license law. If you do it again, we're going to refer you to the district attorney, because that's all we can do. We can't do anything else. And it's not even a warning letter. It's just a letter with our agency letterhead. If KREC has the authority to issue cease and desist orders, then we could use similar channels that we have with licensed individuals to generate compliance. So, they have the option if they're conducting unlicensed activity, they can affiliate with a brokerage and get a license, or stop the activity. And we would have, via legal means, we would have the ability to do that through that order, which is subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. And we could actually, if needed to, go to district court. Again, my hope is the cease and desist order stops the activity and we don't have to go any further. But it does give us a little bit more tools to work with. So just some examples of what we see with respect to unlicensed activity. So we've had a company that's entered into the Kansas market over the last couple of years. Their model is they enter into agency agreements with property owners to, and basically the agency agreement structured in a way that they give them $500, $1,000 up front. But as part of that agreement, the homeowner has to agree to use that entity to sell their home if they choose to sell the home within the next 40 years. They file these agreements at the Register of Deeds office, so they're on the title of the property. If the property owner opts to use another brokerage, then that homeowner has to pay 3% of the property's value as deemed by that company in order to do it. And we're getting these complaints because property owners are coming up to us and like, we're getting ready to close the deal. Title company's like, you've got a lien on this property. And they're like, what lien? What are you talking about? They forgot a couple years ago, they got this $500, loan, and they didn't, and in some cases, actually the property owner is like, I actually tried to use this company, but they wouldn't respond. I tried to get them to sell it, but they wouldn't call me back. So we think that's a real problem, and honestly, it's an activity that would require a license. And if it's a prohibited act, because as if you're a licensee, you are prohibited from filing liens on residential property. It's a prohibited act. The other thing that we see a lot of times is individuals auctioning property. A lot of times we'll see those individuals and they don't have a Kansas license. We had one issue where an individual was auctioning property and he didn't disclose to the seller that there would be a premium fee on the transaction. So seller files a complaint saying, hey, this person charged me this fee, it wasn't disclosed. Unfortunately, we had to tell them there's nothing we could do because we don't have any authority over individuals that are unlicensed, even though auctioning property is an activity that requires a Kansas license. So I just wanted to hit on a couple of those issues. There's lots of other times where we see unlicensed activity. Obviously, with internet and AI, things are getting more sophisticated. So we would appreciate the committee looking favorably on this bill, and I'd be happy to stand any questions.
Committee, any questions? Representative Sutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, there's a whole lot in this bill, and some of it I like and some of it I'm not so thrilled with. But one question that I wanted to ask, this cease and desist, that part makes sense to me. Okay, this is part of it that I do like. Doesn't that get in the, or doesn't that also satisfy the need that we were previously talking about in dealing with bad actors and the assignable contracts?
So yes, I think there would be that would go a long way to that issue. I think the bigger issue and why the association proposed the part about banning the practice of assignable contracts is just we've seen so many instances where people who do that activity are frankly they're bad actors. And for years we've come up here and we've discussed, well, let's get them licensed so they have to comply with these laws. And it's like, so if they're licensed, it's going to be difficult for them to comply because they don't really look out for the fiduciary. They don't have that relationship with the people that they want to buy the property from and then immediately sell the contract. So but from the commission's perspective, we definitely want the cease and desist language. It would go a long ways to fulfill our mission to protect consumers.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. would it be possible to see one of these contracts? I'd like to look through one to see what.
I
mean,
can absolutely give you, I have, honestly, I probably have 10 different versions of what they look like. They seem to change all the time. But yeah, I can absolutely get you a copy of what one of those looks like.
Thank you.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to follow up on the ranking member, if you could submit that to the rest of the committee as well, we'd appreciate that. I think that's a very valid question. And just going back, this is dealing with transparency as well as consumer protection. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, it's not necessarily protectionism for the industry, is it?
Not from the perspective of the Real Estate Commission, no. Our job is to protect consumers.
Okay. And one quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman, and I may have missed it. How much of a hit is the industry or the consumers take? What kind of dollar amount are we talking about here?
Oh, well, I mean, I've seen some transactions where the contract they enter in with the seller, they'll go out, reach out to them, they'll find distressed property, or somebody will call them with the We Buy Ugly Houses phone number or whatever. They'll go in and they'll say, 70,000, and they'll turn around the next day, market that property online to investors for 150,000, or sometimes they do 100,000, but you pay like a $15,000 assignment fee. Yeah, it's a pretty big hit. But the people don't know, a lot of times they target people that are not sophisticated consumers.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little new at this, the concept and everything. The security, the title, Security First, I think is who I went through. But those folk who look at clear titles, there's no other checks or balances in the system that is the reason that we're predicated with this bill. Is that correct? Or is there something else in the system that would catch this?
So let me make sure I understand your question. Is there any other method where these people that are signing equitable, that the wholesalers, to basically catch them before they, yeah. With respect to a title, because usually the title company is not necessarily looking for, the difference in price. The title company, let's say, there's a lien on the property, they would catch that. But how it works is usually the title company will tell the wholesale buyer, hey, there's this lien. And instead of that communication being transferred to the seller saying, hey, you got title, they just walk away from their $10 earnest money and back out of the deal. That's what we've been seeing. And, the consumer or the seller, a lot of times, they already put the money in the bank. They already thought it closed, and it's an unfortunate situation. And it's terrible to tell them when they come to the Real Estate Commission, we cannot do anything for you. In some cases, we've had a few that have gotten interest from the AG's office, but a lot of times they don't.
So if you go back and listen to the first half of the meeting, it might make a little more sense. Can you tell me why you haven't had cease and desist order up until this point? Is there a reason? You've asked for it a few times in the past, and we do have some things in place to stop this. The Attorney General can do it. Can you tell me why you haven't had it before?
Well, we've asked for it. I think this is the 4th year in a row. So, sometimes things get, held up in the legislative process. It's usually been combined with other issues, and maybe that's held it up. But, we're hopeful this time around we'll be granted that authority.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any opponents or any more proponents. Is there anyone else that wishes to testify as a proponent? No. Okay, so I'm also not seeing any neutral or opponents. Is there anyone else that wishes to testify on this bill for any reason? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the hearing on HB 2598. And just a reminder that tomorrow there's a joint meeting in here at noon for lunch on the workers' compensation bill that we have an agreement on. And so there will be lunch served, but I believe you're going to get an email that you're going to have to pick that lunch up on the second floor before you come up here. It'll be combined with something else. So look for an email. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.